Alright, what's going on, guys? Throughout the history of FromSoftware's games and their development, it is no mistake that they've become known primarily for the Souls franchise, and likewise that genre. But as of late, we've entered into a new era, with titles like Elden Ring, nightreign, and the Duskbloods coming out soon, and even the resurrection of the Armored Core franchise. But with this deviation from their standard formula, many people are craving the comeback, and wondering what that comeback is going to look like. Will they ever be able to capture that lightning in a bottle and make another masterpiece like Elden Ring? So today I want to take a deep dive on that exact question and try to predict what the next major Souls-like game from FromSoftware is going to look like. Not their next multiplayer, not their next Armored Core, their next Elden Ring, Dark Souls level game. Because we have clues, we have hints, we have a pattern of history from them on how they develop their next games, and if you know what to look for, then you can paint a pretty good picture. But as we get started today, as always, if you want to stay up to date on all things Elden Ring and FromSoftware, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and now let's get into it. To begin understanding what to look for when imagining the next Souls game, you have to start with the ways that Elden Ring innovated on the series. In the transition from Dark Souls 3 to Sekiro to Elden Ring, the series evolved with each installment in some significant way. Dark Souls 3 took the Dark Souls series, made it significantly faster, innovated on the flow of combat by taking much of the groundwork from Bloodborne, such as boss staggerings, visceral attacks, and movement upgrades in things like the weapon arts. Sekiro then went the extra mile with experimentation, completely changing what we thought a Souls game could be, by introducing an entirely new combat system, significantly faster movement, and for the first time in these kinds of games, a jump. And so you can see how all of this laid the groundwork for what would eventually become Elden Ring, essentially taking the Dark Souls game that we knew and were familiar with, and innovating in so many ways to make an entirely new IP. They took their traditional level design and expanded it dramatically across a plane, making an open world game, and gave the player a horse to ride on, which is essentially just the movement from Sekiro. Things like boss fights, ashes of war, weapon types, and the overall pace of the game was evolved dramatically, but still kept the same framework that we've been used to since the beginning. And when all of this combined, it made Elden Ring feel like a true evolution of the series, with its own completely unique identity. But now the cycle has restarted, and we are very obviously in a state of experimentation. With games like nightreign, the Duskbloods, and even Armored Core 6, these are all potentially groundwork for the next major Souls installment. But before we dive into what exact innovations could transfer into the next game, let's take a look at what Miyazaki has said about what their plans are. There's a quote that we've discussed several times here on the channel, where Miyazaki talks about how much of a toll Elden Ring took on the studio, and if they'd ever be able to go back to that magnitude of game ever again. He says, "Where FromSoftware is right now in terms of scale, I would say Elden Ring is really the limit. We've tapped every resource and talent that we have access to. Scaling it even bigger, I'd have my concerns. Perhaps having multiple projects is the next stage, where some of the other younger talent can have the opportunity to manage and direct game design for a smaller project." And that's exactly what we saw happen with nightreign with the new director Ishizaki. Now, that doesn't mean these games are the future of FromSoftware. That simply means, instead of allocating every single resource to developing the next Souls game, they will work on development on the next Souls game, while having these smaller projects developed alongside and holding over the fans in the meantime. In another quote, he mentions that these smaller projects are their room to fail. They can't experiment 100% with a new major line game like Elden Ring and have it go wrong. So they have to test the waters with a game like nightreign, with a game like the Duskbloods, to see what sticks and what they can implement in the next major title, which again is exactly what we were talking about earlier. But the main quote I wanted to get to is this one. You might say that trying to capture that excitement of those old tabletop games and game books was one facet of making Elden Ring, but I think more than anything it's just my personal preference when it comes to RPGs and exploring fantasy worlds. So you might see some of my personal idiosyncrasies come into play. I'm still in the process of making my ideal fantasy RPG. While Elden Ring is not quite it, it's pretty close. It's getting close. And he then also states directly that he's going to continue with the dark fantasy settings. So what can we extrapolate from these quotes? Well, we can take him at his word and think that the next major RPG from them is still still going to be a fantasy setting. Whether that's more dark fantasy or more high fantasy remains to be seen, but I would still lean towards a more dark fantasy setting, just because that seems to be their signature. Based on these quotes as well, we can reasonably assume they're not going to go open world again, at least not in the same way that Elden Ring was open world. This is just my own speculation, but I would imagine things in the next game are going to be tightened up much more. That's based off feedback from Elden Ring, with a lot of long-time FromSoftware fans wanting something closer to like Dark Souls 3 in terms of level design. And since they innovated so much on the world with Elden Ring, I doubt they'd continue that exact same pattern of innovation in their next game. I would look towards other elements. And again, taking them at their word that the size of Elden Ring was the limit, I would also expect a slightly smaller game, but likely more tightly packed. So what are some exact innovations that we can look to in the current games that we have that have a good chance of showing up in the next major game? Let's take a look at the most obvious, that being Elden Ring nightreign. And here we have a lot of gameplay innovations. Now these I think more than anything have a chance of returning because they're already built into the system of Elden Ring. Now we have a few key ones. Primarily movement speed. The game is much faster than base game Elden Ring. There is more verticality with the elimination of fall damage. You also have character abilities, which are very big innovations, and I think we'll definitely see make a return. Not in the exact same sense that they work in nightreign, but I think we'll see a lot of these abilities be baked into things like weapon arts if those make a return, or general player movement. Things like Wilder's grapple hook, Guardian's flight ultimate, Iron Eye's ability. These are just examples of more testing the waters that can be applied in many different ways. We also have innovations such as the magic system for Recluse. That is exactly the kind of thing that could make a revolution, or the groundwork for a new magic system in the next major Souls game. And we can already see a lot of this at work in the trailer for the Duskbloods. But like nightreign, the Duskbloods is going to be a hero-based game with each individual character having specific abilities. What we have to consider is that all of these different abilities are going to need to be applicable to an RPG setting where the player makes their own character. That's the avenue we have to approach it of, and we have to brainstorm how exactly they can do that. Will that be through a skill tree perhaps? Will that be based on the unique weapon that your character is wielding? When it comes to character abilities like that, that's not too out of the box, but there's something else we need to look at here. In the Duskbloods trailer we see this character who moves like an armored core. The flight pattern is exactly the same, and the Duskbloods also has guns. So as ridiculous as it sounds, Armored Core 6 is another game we should be looking at and thinking, how can elements from this game be translated into a fantasy RPG, Souls-like, and how would that work? And I actually don't think it's that ridiculous to consider because Armored Core 6 was made in the Elden Ring engine. You have things like Wilder's ultimate in nightreign, that's literally just the pile bunker from Armored Core. And it opens up the possibility in their next Souls-like of innovating in the vertical dimension. You know, what if, instead of just a jump and a dodge roll, in the next game, we can fly? Now I know people won't like the sound of that, but if you are someone that played Armored Core 6, you can see how the bosses in this game are an evolution of many of the boss types we had in Elden Ring. Replace missiles and bullets with spells and magic, a primary reliance on melee, and if we're dealing with a very high fantasy setting with more supernatural elements, it's not out of the realm of possibility. Now obviously the next Souls-like game is not going to be an Armored Core. That's not what I'm saying at all. I point to all of that to illustrate that I highly doubt the next major Souls-like game is going to be another melee-focused, methodical dodge roll combat. These three FromSoftware installments all point to innovations in the character movement department, an increase in overall game speed, and more, for lack of a better word, supernatural abilities. I think of the jump from Dark Souls 2 to Bloodborne. There we saw a major evolution. From what players thought was possible in that game type, we're going to see another jump of that caliber from Elden Ring to whatever is next. And that's why I look at a game like Armored Core 6 and think, maybe that is the kind of crazy idea they could have for their next Souls-like. You know, we have a character like Executor in nightreign who can transform into a boss-type beast. What if we see something like that in the next game? Let's take Bale for example here. What if you could turn into a dragon and fight him, and you weren't stuck on the ground? What would that look like? Just some food for thought. And with those ideas, that makes me think about the concept of the world and story they want to tell in the next game. And we know Miyazaki always loves to mix fantasy with cosmic horror and astronomical elements. And we saw that a lot in Bloodborne, but also a lot in Elden Ring, with things like the outer gods, the meteorites, and the alien creatures in the eternal cities. That is a potential avenue to explore supernatural character and player abilities and introduce more advanced movement. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the next Souls game lean much more into not sci-fi, but that cosmic aspect, and not necessarily in the way of cosmic horror, but quite literally dealing with things like space magic. Pure speculation, but I'm just noticing a pattern here. And we've had pretty much the same magic system, even from a lore perspective, since Demon Souls. Now yes, glintstone is different from soul magic, but when you get deep enough into it, it's not really that different. We are very long overdue for a new type of magic, and for that to manifest differently than just casting the exact same spells since Dark Souls 1 from a staff. That's another avenue to think about. And then the final place my mind goes is, how does that mix with typical sword and shield combat? What are ways that we're going to see things like this play out while still retaining the typical melee combat in a fantasy setting that we know they're not going to completely do away with? And I'm really not sure what the idea there could be. Maybe we see some kind of integrated magic system that translates through the weaponry as well, but that feels a little simple. I'm sure they'll be much more creative. But all of that is to illustrate that FromSoftware is constantly in the business of innovation. They think outside the box, and 9 times out of 10, it lands. Which is why when we look at the pattern of games they're putting out right now, it all points to that the next major Souls installment is not just going to be Dark Souls 5. I think we're really going to see the formula shaken up, imagined in new ways that nobody is expecting. And if history is anything to go off of, that's exactly what's going to happen. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. How exactly do you think they're going to innovate in the next Souls installment? Do you think they're going to go as crazy with it as I've said here? Or do you think they're going to stick with what worked in Elden Ring and not try anything too crazy? Let me know down in the comments section below. With all that though, if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here, and I will catch you in the next one.